Hey all, my name is Joe. Welcome to Unleashed by Faith, and thank you for joining me on this Bible study. So this is 1 Peter 3:15, and in it he says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." So have you ever seen like somebody for me, it's like my grandparents. My grandparents were like the living embodiment of what Christians were. I don't know what they were like when they're 40s, and I mean, they've probably similar to me. I don't know, but to me, in my head, they were always like this perfect, godly people, and so I always kind of wondered, like, especially now as an adult, like, why did grandma and grandpa have everything just together? They seemed to have life figured out. They were always on the same page. They always worked together. They were of one mind, even though they were both very independent and very strong willed people. But they embodied what Christ has taught. They both filled their roles in their marriage to the T. Now, I don't know if that's because, they were married, I think like almost 60 years or something insane. But I don't know if it was something because of that or something they had figured out early on. That's something I wish I could go back in time and ask them. However, it's kind of a moot point, really. The point that I'm making is I've always wondered why they had the hope and the character and the personality that they did. Now going back, I know it's because of their walk with God and their walk with Christ and just the way they lived their lives. And so then I kind of, now I reflect on myself. Am I living in a way that my kids and maybe even my grandkids one day will look back and be like, wow, dad or grandpa or, maybe a neighbor or somebody I work with just really say, man, Joe really seems to have it together. He is walking the path of Christ that I wish we were on. Or at least he's living his life in a way that I wish I was living mine. And so that they could come up to me and say, hey, where do you get this from? Like, how are you, doing this? How are you living your life in this way? And I want to be prepared to tell them I'm living this way because I'm following the example that Christ set and that I'm working to build the character and myself as a person that Christ called me to be, and that I'm using. If you go on a little bit later on in Peter, he talks about this is chapter 4, so just maybe 20 verses later, chapter 4 verse 10, and he says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. So Peter's telling us, I don't have an aptitude for medicine. I don't have an aptitude for many things. So my gifts aren't in healing others. My gifts aren't in that way. So I need to use the gifts that God gave me and the strengths that I feel to help others, to win them over for Christ, or even just to serve them where they're at. Even if they're not Christ followers, I still want to be able to serve and just be better, make their lives better. So Peter's telling us to be prepared for that. And so the hard truth is nobody comes up to me and says, man, where do you get the hope that you have in life? Where do you have this, this disposition? And, where do you get this? I never get that about my character. So that's definitely something I need to work on. And what 2026 is going to be a big part of my life. And a lot of these videos moving forward are going to be moving into what's known as servant leadership and my study into that. So just subscribe if you want more on that, or just keep checking the channel if you don't want to subscribe. But definitely I'm going to be diving into that more because I think I can make those internal changes to not please other people, but to make myself better. So that way I am serving others and moving the kingdom forward and not just, existing and taking up space on this planet. So how do you know if you're living that way. Well, Peter tells us people are going to come up and talk to us. And what's sad is this the same advice I give to people in my career, in my professional life, when they say, how do I know like when I got it figured out? How do I know when I'm doing a good job? And first of all, many professionals, you only find out when you're doing something wrong. Sadly, that's the only time you really get feedback is, hey, you need to fix this, you need to correct that. Very rarely, unless it's like a big win, people are like, hey man, way to go. You did a great job on that. I really appreciated how you did this. Most of the time, we don't get that type of feedback unless it's, a scheduled feedback session. So the way we know when we're doing well, for me, is when somebody comes up to me and says, hey, how do I do this thing? It's something that I'm learning, something that I'm trying to work through. When somebody comes up to me and says, how do you work in this program? How do you, create these products? When somebody comes up to me and asks me those questions, you're not going to ask that of somebody who's not doing a good job. So clearly, that's your signal that others see the value that you are producing and the things that you are doing well. Well, why aren't we doing that in our Christian life? Why aren't we working to do things well? Why aren't we working to do things better so that others do come up to us and say, hey, where do you get that hope from? And how can I get me some of that? And that's something that, one, we need to be prepared to answer. But two, I think the deeper thing is we need to use our gifts. Peter tells us. And then later on, and we'll talk about, because I'm actually building my study on servant leadership off of 2 Peter, some of the advice he gives a little bit later on. So he tells us to use our gifts to serve others, essentially. And when we do that well, and when we know we're doing it well, is when others come up to us and say, hey, how do I live the way you're living? So ask yourself that today. I'd love to hear what you think, and I'd love to hear how you plan to live that way and to share your hope with others. Let me know in the comments, or you can email me. If you go to the About page, you can find my email there. Thank you, everyone.